We're also delighted to be joined by two esteemed colleagues from Janes, Terry Pattar, the Director of our Janes National Security and Government Unit, and Stacy, a Senior Director in Global Innovation and Strategic Development, who brings extensive experience working at the heart of the US national security community. So without further ado, with these introductions concluded, I'll hand over to my colleagues Heather and Olivia to begin the data trends section.
Thanks, Matt, and hello everyone. So, as you all know, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State currently represent the two most prominent transnational militant Islamist actors. These groups have continued to be operationally active across core theatres in the Middle East and South Asia, as well as in more distant theatres in the 2 decades following the 9/11 attacks on the US. Starting from 2009, Jane's Terrorism and Insurgency Centre has conducted extensive open source tracking of the operational activities of these two groups and their various affiliates. We'd like to talk to you now about what the open source data collected by Jane's tells us about key trends in the tempo, intensity, focus and methods of transnational militant Islamists, as well as to chart the evolution of the threat they represent. Our analysis largely covers the period 2009 to 2020, and we'll begin by discussing transnational militant Islamism as a whole, before delving into a comparison between the activities of the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and then exploring each group in more detail. In the period between 2009 and 2020, Jane's recorded at least 25,619 attacks by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, inclusive of affiliates, but excluding lone actors, which resulted in at least 61,248 non-militant fatalities. For context, this represents 13% of all attacks by non-state armed groups worldwide in the same period, and 23% of all resultant non-militant fatalities. In terms of geographical distribution, these attacks were conducted over a broad scope from the coast of West Africa across to Southeast Asia, although the clear concentration has been in key conflict theatres in the Middle East, East Africa and West Africa. From a top-level perspective, there are clear trends and preferences in militants' operational methods and targeting. Despite nuance at a local level and between different groups and affiliates, transnational militant Islamist violence has targeted security forces in more than half of all recorded attacks over this 12-year period. This has consistently been the case on a year-by-year basis, though, with some fluctuations in the comparative level of violence driven by local and temporal factors. Although there is a greater degree of variance in terms of tactical preference, close-quarter mobile engagements and indirect fire attacks or the use of explosives collectively account for more than 2/3 of all attacks by transnational militant Islamist groups during that period. When viewed on a year-by-year basis, there is a clear emphasis on the use of these tactics during the heaviest periods of fighting in Iraq and Syria, especially between 2014 and 2017.
We'd now like to move on to our comparative analysis, in which we distinguish between Islamic State and Al-Qaeda violence. Beginning with the geographic distribution of attacks, we can clearly see on the map distinct clusters of activity for each group, with areas of Al-Qaeda activity marked in orange and Islamic State activity in black. For Al-Qaeda, 3 zones with particularly high concentrations are visible: Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. JTIC has recorded a contiguous area of violence conducted by al-Shabaab from south-central Somalia down to eastern Kenya. In northwestern Syria, Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, which now operates separately from Al-Qaeda as part of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and Tanzim Haras al-Din have combated Syrian military forces across Idlib, Aleppo, and Hama Governorate. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has conducted a significant number of attacks across southern Yemen, though the group's operational activity has been masked in recent years due to its infiltration into tribal militias. Conversely, extremely high levels of Islamic State activity have been recorded across Iraq and Syria, as well as the Lake Chad region of West Africa. Smaller clusters of Islamic State activity are visible along Libya's Mediterranean coast, as well as the northern reaches of Egypt's Sinai Peninsula and eastern Afghanistan. The chart displayed demonstrates the divergent operational profiles of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda's tempo of violence has been comparatively steadier than its rivals, albeit with the group having conducted far fewer attacks in total. The Islamic State's operational tempo, on the other hand, has varied significantly between years. As you can see, a sharp 71% drop in attacks was recorded between 2017 and 2018, the year in which the group lost large swathes of territory in Iraq and Syria. So the Islamic State's activity between 2009 and 2020 can be divided into three phases. During the first phase, between 2009 and 2012, the group, then known as the Islamic State in Iraq, conducted fewer attacks than its fellow al-Qaeda affiliates collectively. In 2013, the group severed its ties with al-Qaeda, and the following year, Ibrahim al-Badri, better known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, announced the group's rebranding as the Islamic State. Between 2014 and 2017, the group's activity increased significantly year on year, and by a total of 844% across the period. Notably, al-Qaeda's attack tempo also increased during this time, as both groups engaged in clashes with each other and became deeply embroiled in the Syrian civil war. Lastly, between 2018 and 2020, the frequency of Islamic State attacks remained consistently higher than its rivals, but the gap closed as a result of the rapid decline in the Islamic State's rate of operations. During this time, the group was unable to replicate the operational tempo exhibited while it controlled territory and was unable to engage in more conventional conflict with enemies in Iraq and Syria.
Thanks, Liv. So we'll now delve a bit deeper into the Islamic State's activity specifically. Between 2009 and 2020, Jane's recorded a total of 19,488 attacks by the Islamic State and its affiliates, which resulted in at least 49,252 non-militant fatalities. To contextualize our data, we'd like to state that while the Islamic State was officially declared in mid-2014, its precursor groups, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, and prior to that, the Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI, had begun operating as such since 2006. Therefore, at the beginning of the reporting period, the only Islamic State attacks being recorded were being conducted by the ISI, before its subsequent expansion to Syria and formation of ISIL in 2013. Furthermore, where affiliates were created by accepting a pledge of allegiance from an existing group, for example, Boko Haram becoming Wilayat Gharba Farqiya in 2015, attacks by such groups are only included from the point of the pledge of allegiance being accepted. So the tactic most used by Islamic State militants across the reporting period was engagement, which covers close quarters encounters between two actors in open ground. This reflects the conventional clashes engaged in by Islamic State militants with security forces and other militant groups across its theatres of operation, particularly in Iraq and Syria during defensive efforts around key urban centres such as Mosul and Raqqa. Since the loss of territory in Iraq and Syria, though, the group has reverted to asymmetric operational methods, including the use of standoff area attack and assassination tactics, while in West Africa, the group has increasingly utilised assault tactics and challenging the state for control of territory. So security forces have consistently been the primary target of Islamic State operations across the reporting period, being targeted in almost half of all recorded attacks. It is also noteworthy that other non-state armed groups have been heavily targeted by the group, with these targeting trends underlining the Islamic State's intent to establish sole control and governance of territory and being willing to fight state authorities or its non-state rivals to do so. This was particularly the case in Syria across the mid-2010s, while in other conflict theatres, the group's focus on establishing de facto control of territory resulted in a primary focus on targeting the security forces. Although the Islamic State expanded its operational presence across the mid to late 2010s, beyond its origins in Iraq and Syria, the group's violent activity has been largely centralised in these two countries, jointly accounting for more than 85% of all recorded attacks between 2009 and 2020. Even as the recorded number of attacks in Iraq and Syria fell sharply after 2017, over the following 3 years, the two countries never fell below a proportional threshold of 2/3 of all attacks. This was indicative to an extent of the Islamic State regrouping and restarting asymmetric campaigns in its core Iraqi and Syrian theatres, but also of operational setbacks in the Islamic State's provinces in Libya, Afghanistan, and Egypt. On both a qualitative and quantitative level, though, it is evident that the territorial defeat suffered by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria has facilitated the growing importance of Islamic State provinces beyond those countries, with West Africa being the most important example. Indeed, West Africa province achieved an extent of parity with Iraq and Syria in terms of attack numbers in 2019, after 4 previous years of being a very distant third. And in 2020, West Africa exceeded the number of recorded attacks in Syria, while still falling behind Iraq. The Pledge of Allegiance to the Islamic State by Islamist militants in northern Mozambique and eastern DRC, resulting in the creation of Central Africa Province in 2020, represented the rare incidence of a new province being established and its operating activity intensifying significantly. Indeed, in 2020, Central Africa Province conducted more attacks than any province except Iraq, Syria, and West Africa.
So, having covered the Islamic State, we will now go on to explore trends in relation to al-Qaeda in more detail. Between 2009 and 2020, James recorded a total of 7,466 attacks conducted by al-Qaeda and its affiliates, which resulted in at least 12,132 non-militant fatalities. So, as clearly visible in both the pie and line charts shown, engagement was by some distance the tactic most frequently used by al-Qaeda militants between 2009 and 2020. This demonstrates that al-Qaeda militants have engaged in mobile clashes with armed adversaries, either security forces or other militants, indicating that they often choose to conduct relatively conventional attacks. Further confirming this trend, our data shows that assault was the third most used tactic, showing that al-Qaeda militants frequently attacked fixed positions capable of offering resistance. Raids, on the other hand, a form of operation characterized by its targeting of civilians, were conducted less than half as frequently as assaults. The majority of engagements were recorded in the theatres where al-Qaeda's affiliates have been most active during the period in question, which are Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Al-Qaeda's targeting patterns do not differ markedly from the Islamic State's. Security forces were targeted most in over half of all al-Qaeda attacks recorded between 2009 and 2020. This is unsurprising given the theatres of al-Qaeda's militancy. In both Syria and Somalia, the insurgencies have resembled largely conventional conflicts. As such, al-Qaeda-aligned militants have been engaged in frequent and direct clashes with security forces. Other non-state armed groups were next most frequently targeted. This was driven overwhelmingly by actions of al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria, who have regularly clashed with rival groups such as the Islamic State and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Indeed, 84% of al-Qaeda attacks targeting other groups were recorded in Syria. The only other target accounting for more than 10% of total attacks was violence conducted randomly or indiscriminately at 13%. The geographical distribution of these attacks differed significantly from those targeting security forces or other militants, with the majority of them, 61%, perpetrated in Somalia, compared to only 21% in Syria. This indicates that al-Shabaab has conducted a large number of attacks in which collateral damage is deemed acceptable, or indeed the eventual target is less important than the act of conducting the attack itself. Of the 603 random or indiscriminate attacks conducted in Somalia, 53% of them involved the use of explosives or indirect fire tactical weapons, such as mortars. Consistent increases in operational tempo by al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria were recorded between 2011 and 2017, as Jabhat al-Nusra, renamed as Jabhat Fath al-Sham in 2016, developed into a central faction in the Syrian civil war. After the Islamic State, the group was the dominant militant Islamist entity operating in the country until large segments of its membership merged with other extremist factions to form Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. HTS broke from al-Qaeda to become an autonomous group, which explains the rapid decline in al-Qaeda attacks in Syria year on year since 2017. Indeed, JTIC recorded a 56% drop in operations between 2017 and 2018. However, Tanzim Haras al-Din represents militant Islamist loyal to al-Qaeda, and the group has continued to operate in northwestern Syria, ensuring a steady rate of attacks in the country are still recorded. The longevity and operational sophistication of al-Shabaab as an al-Qaeda affiliate explains why Somalia stands as the most affected group, as well as Kenya in fourth, as al-Shabaab is active in Mandera and Lamu counties. Of the 7,771 attacks conducted by al-Qaeda and its affiliates between 2009 and 2020, 81% of them were recorded in Syria and Somalia, demonstrating both the strength of affiliates and the general state of insecurity therein. Notable numbers of attacks were also recorded in Yemen and Mali, where al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb are active. So next, we'd like to briefly cover the activities of lone actors inspired by transnational militant Islamism, but not deemed by James to be fully fledged members of the two groups. Actors inspired by the Islamic State's ideology conducted far more attacks than those inspired by al-Qaeda between 2009 and 2020. JTIC recorded 37 attacks where the motivation of lone actors or small cells inspired by militant Islamist ideology could be clearly tied to one of the two groups in question. Only 19% of these were linked to al-Qaeda. The majority of these attacks were conducted in Europe. Actors inspired by the Islamic State were responsible for the overwhelming majority of non-militant fatalities during the period in question, accounting for 82% of the 159 fatalities recorded. Outside of Europe, lone actor attacks resulting in fatalities were recorded in Central Asia, the United States, and the Maldives. So as you can see from the chart on the left, since the Islamic State's territorial expansion in 2014, attacks inspired by militant Islamists have increased rapidly in frequency. While rudimentary edged or improvised instruments are the most common weapon types used, demonstrating the low capabilities of radicalized individuals that generally perpetrate these attacks, 6 other forms of weapons have been recorded by James, including firearms and explosives, showing the diversity in the type of attacks conducted by these actors.
Thanks, Liv. And finally, to finish off our data trend section, we'll now look at some very brief top-level trends recorded by JTIC so far this year. So in the first 6 months of 2021, JTIC recorded 768 attacks by al-Qaeda and Islamic State militants and their respective affiliates, which resulted in at least 1,704 non-militant fatalities, which represented 8% of all attacks by non-state armed groups globally in the same period and 14% of all resultant non-militant fatalities. Both numbers have surpassed the halfway mark of the total number of attacks and non-militant fatalities of 2020. Therefore, it is likely the tempo of violence and resultant fatalities in 2021 will match or exceed those recorded last year. In terms of geographical distribution, and similarly to the previous 2009-2020 period, these attacks were conducted over a broad scope with a clear concentration in key conflict theatres in the Middle East, East Africa and West Africa. When examining the top 5 countries by number of attacks in the first 6 months of 2021, Iraq accounted for 33% of all attacks, with Syria accounting for 22%. This represents a change from the 2009 to 2020 period, during which attacks were primarily concentrated in Syria. In the first 6 months of 2021, JTIC observed a continuation of the shift in the group's main areas of operation that was recorded towards the end of the 2009-2020 period. As you can see on the slide, 7 out of the top 10 countries by Islamic State and AQ attacks in 2021 took place in sub-Saharan Africa, compared with only 4 in the 2009-2020 period, a 12-year stretch mostly dominated by activity in the Middle East and North Africa. Essentially provides further evidence of the Islamic State's attempt to expand its operations following the group's loss of territory in Iraq and Syria. And finally, looking at the pie charts on the tactics and targeting of both groups, assaults on fixed military positions and standoff area attacks were the preferred modes of attack, particularly in Iraq and Syria. Raids on civilian communities also accounted for over a fifth of total attacks and were recorded extensively in Nigeria and Mozambique. Similar to previous years, security forces were the most targeted by transnational militant Islamists in the first 6 months of 2021. In particular, over half of all attacks in both Syria and Iraq during this time were conducted against security forces.
Great. So a big thank you to Heather and Liv, and to echo my colleagues, good afternoon and good morning, and thank you for joining today's roundtable. So as mentioned earlier, JTIC is producing an in-depth report that will take stock of how Islamist militancy has changed since 9/11 and how the threat landscape is likely to develop going forward. As well as building on the data that my colleagues have just presented on, JTIC is developing a set of scenarios in relation to Al-Qaeda Islamic State relations, future strategy for militant Islamism, and dynamics between key affiliates. So the aim of today's more interactive sessions is to inform this scenario development through expert insights, so resulting in the final report. So in terms of the format of these discussions, we will focus each of the sessions on a short expert brief, followed by a set of core questions. And if you would like to say something, please do use the raise hand Teams function, and the moderator, which will be Matt or myself, depending on the session, will call on individuals to share their contributions. So we'd very much encourage open discussion, and with that in mind, and as bandwidth allows, as far as possible, would ask for panelist cameras to remain switched on for the interactive sessions if you're comfortable with that and actively participating. So now moving into the first scenario session, the focus is on future relations between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State over the next 18 to 24 months. So we've heard from Heather and Liv about trends relating to the group's attack tempo, tactics, and targeting. And this session will now explore the interactions between the two groups. So we'll both explore current dynamics and look also at whether we might see intensified competition in key conflict zones, including the Sahel and Yemen, or indeed whether there are factors that could drive greater collaboration between the two groups going forward. So in terms of a running order for this session, I will first call on Colin Clarke, a senior research fellow at the Soufan Centre, to share his insights on the current state of relations between Al-Qaeda and Islamic State before opening up a wider discussion on future dynamics between the two groups. So Colin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kate, and thanks to James for the invitation. There's some scholars and analysts on this call who I have great respect for, and I follow all your work really closely, which helps inform my own work. So it's great to be on with such illustrious company. The exercise itself is also really useful as I'm preparing to write an article on the evolution of the global jihadist movement for the 20-year anniversary for the CTC Sentinel. So I'm looking at this as a learning exercise to shape my own kind of understanding. So I think, I touch upon a lot of different scenarios after the caliphate, and in particular with the future of AQ-IS relations. I talk about the status quo, which is what I'll start with, rapprochement, and then outbidding as three. There's probably other combinations within this kind of broader context, but those are the three that I think deserve the most attention. In mid-2021, where things stand now, I see further decentralization of both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. I think what you may end up with, especially given weakening command and control, is status quo in one region and the potential for outbidding in another. I don't think we can look at the map and see things monolithically. I just don't think that's where the situation stands now or where it's heading. So you may very well have one situation in the Sahel that looks totally different than the Arabian Peninsula, that looks different from what's developing in parts of South Asia. In fact, I think that's very likely. From a Western perspective, I think the best case of the three scenarios would be status quo, because the groups are competing for resources and manpower, in effect, occupying their own bandwidth with each other to a certain degree. The risk becomes if competition heats up too much and intensifies, it could lead to this scenario of outbidding, where in order to be perceived as the strong horse groups begin to escalate attacks, both in terms of frequency, but also in terms of intensity. We could see an uptick in suicide attacks. It could also manifest itself in an effort to launch spectacular attacks or external operations outside of the region, as well as a more concerted effort to harness emerging technologies like drones in order to dedicate more resources to other technologies like a more sophisticated social media footprint for both spreading propaganda, but also recruitment. Rapprochement has been dismissed as the least likely of these scenarios, but I think there's some nuance that's missing from that discussion quite often. And so I look at where the fissures exist most strongly at present. And I think that tends to be at the top, at the strategic level, where well-known jihadist ideologues are sniping at each other on social media and attacking each other. The question becomes, do the mid-level commanders and those below them at the rank and file level, foot soldiers, etc., also hold the same degree of enmity between the groups? I think it depends, and in some cases it's probably unlikely. With Baghdadi dead and al-Qaeda seemingly moving toward a new phase, marked in part by the 20-year anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, but also the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, could this usher in a détente between al-Qaeda and IS? Again, I think any of the options may not be likely when assessing these groups across the globe. So I think we really need to look at these at a regional level and maybe even at a country level. But I do think that we're moving toward further decentralization and atomization with groups in the Sahel, the Horn, the Levant, Arabian Peninsula, etc., more focused on local or regional issues than transnational ones. And I'm sure we'll discuss a lot of the factors that could change that calculus. Again, with the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and potentially from other global hotspots, we may see a rejuvenation or revival of some AQ and IS affiliates, and some of those trends that you showed earlier may indeed begin to change. I think, my view from the Beltway is that the zeitgeist is all about great power competition. And unless it's about China or Russia, or to a lesser extent Iran, people don't want to hear it. In fact, to large segments of DC, counterterrorism is dead, and they're thankful. The book-ended 20-year anniversary of 9/11, something to leave behind. And I think we've seen this movie before in other contexts, and it typically doesn't end well. I think there's a number of wild cards, right, that could change the calculus. The pandemic being at the top of that list in a number of ways. But there's other wild cards. I think a large-scale attack in the West. I think a civil war that attracts foreign fighters as a magnet. And I mean, beyond Syria, we could see civil war in other parts of the world, not only in well-known hotspots, but in places we're not thinking of at the moment. And how does that impact foreign fighter flow, not only from the West, but also from kind of regional and neighboring countries? Instead of talking about one center of gravity, I think we're talking about multiple nodes. And then I wonder what happens with the Taliban government in Afghanistan if we move down that road. Looking forward to hearing what Antonio has to say about that and how that impacts the dynamics within Afghanistan and within the broader region.